Rain fell in heavy sheets over the quiet street when Marcus Reed threw his wife's suitcase onto the porch. The leather case hit the wet concrete and split open, scattering a folded sweater and a pair of worn shoes across the steps. He stood in the doorway with his jaw tight and his eyes cold. A man who had once whispered promises into this woman's hair, now looking at her like a stranger who had overstayed a welcome she never truly had. "Get out," he said, his voice flat and final. "You brought nothing into this house but bad luck." Angela Whitfield knelt slowly in the rain and gathered her belongings piece by piece, her fingers steady despite the cold soaking through her sleeves. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice or beg him to reconsider, though 4 years of marriage stood behind that closing door like a house built on sand. She simply looked up at him with a sadness so quiet it barely made a sound, and a small, aching smile crossed her lips. 4 years, she said softly. I kept my promise to you the whole time. Marcus, even when you stopped keeping yours. He did not answer. He only stepped back and slammed the door so hard the porch light flickered, and Angela was left standing alone in the storm with a broken suitcase and a marriage she could no longer save. What Marcus did not know, what he could not have imagined in his wildest moments of self-congratulation, was that the woman he had just cast into the rain was the very reason his company still existed. Behind boardroom doors and under names that were never her own, Angela had spent years quietly steering contracts worth tens of millions of dollars, saving him from a collapse he never even saw coming. He believed he had built an empire with his own 2 hands. He had no idea the woman walking away in the dark had been the architect the entire time, and that in 3 weeks, when the truth finally surfaced in front of every shareholder who mattered, the whole city would fall silent in disbelief. Angela was 38 years old, a woman whose calm exterior concealed a mind sharper than anyone in her circle ever gave her credit for. She had grown up watching her mother stretch a single paycheck across an entire month, and that early lesson in scarcity had shaped her into someone who understood money not as a status symbol but as a tool, something to be respected, studied, and used wisely. She held an economics degree she rarely mentioned, and a talent for reading markets that seemed almost intuitive. Yet she never flaunted any of it. She dressed simply. She drove an older sedan long after she could have afforded something newer. She believed that quiet competence spoke louder than any performance ever could, and for years, that belief had served her well. Marcus had been different once. When they met, he was a mid-level logistics manager with restless ambition and a hunger to prove himself to a family that had never quite believed in him. Angela saw something in him worth investing in, not just financially, but emotionally, and she poured herself into supporting his climb the way a gardener tends something fragile and promising. He used to call her his secret weapon back then, half joking, half sincere, and there was a tenderness between them that felt unbreakable. But success, when it finally arrived in full force, did something to Marcus that Angela had not fully anticipated. It fed a hunger in him that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with proving he no longer needed anyone. As his company grew, so did his ego, swelling in proportion to every headline that praised his vision and every handshake from men who wanted a piece of what he had built. He began to believe, sincerely and completely, that every success belonged to him alone, that his instincts and his hustle had carved this empire out of nothing. Angela never argued the point. She never once said, "Actually, let me show you the contracts I negotiated," or, "Do you remember who called those investors when the banks turned you away?" She stayed in the background, content to let him shine, believing that a marriage was not a ledger where credit needed to be tallied and claimed. His family did not share her patience for silence, though they mistook it for something else entirely. His mother, Diane, had never warmed to Angela, viewing her as plain and unremarkable next to the women she imagined her son deserved. She'd say it at family dinners with a saccharine smile, remarking that Angela contributed nothing to the household, that she simply existed alongside Marcus's success, like a passenger riding in a car she never helped build. His sisters echoed the sentiment in smaller, crueler ways, commenting on Angela's modest wardrobe or her quiet nature, as though these were flaws rather than choices. Marcus, drowning in his own growing arrogance, began to absorb these opinions like water into dry soil, and slowly, the seeds of resentment his family had planted began to take root inside him. There was a particular evening, months before the final break, that Angela would later remember as the moment she understood exactly how deep the rot had grown inside her marriage. Marcus had invited a group of investors to a dinner at their home, the kind of gathering where every detail mattered, from the wine selection to the conversation, steering carefully around anything that might make him look less than masterful. Angela had spent the entire afternoon preparing the meal herself, choosing dishes she knew would impress without seeming showy, arranging the table with the quiet care of someone who understood hospitality as an art rather than an obligation. When the guests arrived, and the conversation eventually turned toward the company's recent growth, one investor casually asked Angela what she did for a living, curious about the woman standing quietly beside such an ambitious man. Before she could answer, Marcus laughed and waved a hand dismissively, saying she mostly kept the household running while he handled the real work, and the table laughed along with him as though the comment were nothing more than harmless affection. Angela smiled through it, refilling wine glasses and clearing plates, absorbing the small humiliation the way she had absorbed so many others, telling herself that a man under pressure sometimes said careless things he did not fully mean. By the time autumn arrived that year, something had shifted permanently in the marriage, though Angela sensed it long before Marcus ever said the words aloud. He grew distant during dinners, his eyes fixed on his phone rather than on her face, his conversations clipped and impatient in a way they never used to be. He started comparing her, quietly at first, to the polished, camera-ready women who orbited his professional world, women who wore designer labels and spoke in confident sound bites at industry galas. Angela watched all of this unfold with a heaviness in her chest that she never let show on her face because she understood something Marcus did not yet grasp: that a person who forgets who helped build their foundation is often the first to watch it crumble. It was on an unremarkable Tuesday evening, over a dinner Angela had cooked without being asked, that Marcus finally said what had been building in him for months. He set down his fork, looked at her with an expression she barely recognized as belonging to the man she married, and told her he wanted a divorce. He said it the way a man announces a business decision, calm and rehearsed, as though he had practiced the words in a mirror. Angela set down her own fork and simply nodded, absorbing the blow without letting it break her composure, though something inside her chest cracked quietly in that moment. And so began the unraveling of a marriage that no one in that dining room fully understood, least of all the man who thought he was the one doing the leaving. To understand how far Angela's influence truly extended, one had to look back 5 years earlier, to a winter when Marcus's company had stood on the edge of complete collapse. A key shipping contract had fallen through, taking with it nearly a third of the company's projected revenue, and within weeks, the banks that had once courted Marcus with easy credit lines suddenly grew cold and cautious. Investors who had promised loyalty at champagne toasts began quietly pulling their money, spooked by rumors of instability rippling through industry circles. Marcus paced their apartment floor late into the night back then, running numbers that refused to add up, terrified that everything he had built was about to vanish before it had even fully formed. Angela watched him unravel during those weeks, and rather than offer empty comfort, she made a decision that would alter the entire trajectory of both their lives, though Marcus would remain unaware of it for years. She reached out quietly to contacts from her earlier career in finance, relationships she had cultivated long before Marcus ever entered her life, people who trusted her judgment implicitly because she had never once given them reason not to. She began negotiating on his behalf, restructuring outstanding debts, rewriting the strategic plan the banks demanded before they would extend new credit. She drafted the language of contracts late at night, while Marcus slept beside her, exhausted and unaware that his wife was quietly rewriting the future of his company from their kitchen table. But Angela understood something crucial about the fragile ecosystem of ego and pride that surrounded ambitious men like Marcus, and so she made every move through an intermediary consulting firm registered under a name that bore no connection to her own. She called it Harlow Strategic Partners, a small entity she had built years earlier during a previous chapter of her career. one that existed quietly in the background of countless deals without ever demanding recognition. When the investors returned, when the banks extended new terms, when the contracts were signed and the company pulled back from the edge of ruin, Marcus believed entirely that his own brilliance had saved the day. Angela simply smiled from across the room during those celebratory dinners, raising her glass along with everyone else, content to watch him shine without ever needing the credit for herself. As the years passed, and the company grew from a struggling logistics firm into a regional powerhouse, Marcus's transformation accelerated in ways that troubled Angela more with each passing month. Friends who had once been distant acquaintances suddenly wanted his attention at every gathering, flattering him with compliments about his instincts and his fearless deal-making. Business journalists wrote profiles calling him a visionary, a self-made success story, who had clawed his way back from the brink through sheer force of will. His employees, eager to stay in his good graces, learned quickly that praising Marcus's decisions was far safer than questioning them. And so an entire culture of flattery grew up around him, like ivy choking a tree. There were smaller cruelties too, the kind that rarely made for dramatic scenes but accumulated quietly over time, like sediment settling at the bottom of a river. Marcus stopped introducing her by name at events, referring to her only as his wife in passing, as though the specifics of who she was no longer warranted mention. He forgot her birthday 1 year entirely, remembering only when a calendar reminder popped up on his assistant's screen 2 days later, and even then, he offered nothing more than a hurried apology and an expensive gift meant to smooth over the oversight. Angela stopped expecting grand gestures somewhere along the way, adjusting her own expectations downward with the quiet resignation of someone who had decided that peace mattered more than confrontation. She told herself these were small things, forgivable in the context of a demanding career, and she buried her disappointment beneath the same composed exterior she showed the rest of the world. Angela began to feel, with increasing clarity, that she had become an inconvenience in the story Marcus was telling about himself, a loose thread that did not fit the narrative of the self-made man he wanted the world to believe in. Diane's voice grew louder in his ear during this period, repeating the same refrain at every opportunity, insisting that Angela was clinging to him, that she had latched onto his success rather than earned any part of it. Marcus, weakened by his own vanity and hungry for a version of his life story that required no debts of gratitude, began to believe his mother's version of events more than his own memory of the truth. He started attending industry events without inviting Angela along, appearing in photographs beside sharp, ambitious women who understood how to command a room the way boardrooms expected. Angela never confronted him about these absences, never demanded explanations or made scenes that would have given his family further ammunition against her. She stayed quiet, watching the distance between them grow, with a kind of solemn dignity that few people around her could have managed under the same pressure. Anyone paying close attention during those months would have seen a woman quietly sacrificing her own dignity and comfort to protect a marriage that was already dying, absorbing blow after blow, without complaint, because she still believed, somewhere beneath the hurt, that the man she married was still in there somewhere. But belief alone cannot resurrect what pride has already decided to bury, and the distance between them only widened with each passing week. The night everything finally broke arrived without much warning, though in hindsight Angela realized every sign had been building toward this exact moment for months. Marcus came home late one evening, carrying a folder of signed divorce papers, his expression unreadable, his movements brisk and businesslike, as though he were closing an unremarkable transaction rather than ending a marriage. He told her she needed to be out of the house by morning, that he had already spoken to his lawyer, that everything had been decided, and there was nothing left to discuss. Angela stood in the hallway of the home they had shared for years and felt something inside her go very still, not from shock, but from the strange calm that comes when a long-feared moment finally arrives. She packed only what fit into a single suitcase, refusing to take anything Marcus might later accuse her of stealing, though everything in that house bore some trace of her hands and her care. Before she walked out into the night, she placed 3 objects carefully on the kitchen table where she knew he would find them: her set of house keys, The wedding ring he had once slid onto her finger with trembling hands, and a folded letter she had written earlier that week, in case this exact moment ever came. Marcus did not read the letter. He barely glanced at it before crossing the room, opening the fireplace, and tossing it into the flames without a second thought, watching the paper curl and blacken, as though burning away the last evidence of a chapter he was eager to forget. Angela walked out into the rain that night with nothing but her suitcase and her composure, refusing to look back at the house or the man standing silhouetted in its doorway. The storm soaked through her coat within minutes, but she kept walking, her step steady, her spine straight, carrying herself the way a woman carries herself when she has already decided that this moment, however painful, will not be the one that defines her. Marcus watched her disappear into the darkness from behind the glass of the front door, feeling nothing but a strange, hollow satisfaction that he mistook for relief, unaware that he had just watched the true foundation of his empire walk away from him forever. The unraveling began almost immediately, though Marcus was too consumed by his own sense of victory to notice the early signs of trouble. Within days, a long-time overseas partner who had always dealt exclusively through Harlow Strategic Partners stopped returning calls, citing vague concerns about restructuring on their end. A major shipping contract that had been in final negotiations for months suddenly collapsed without explanation, the other party simply withdrawing with a brief, unhelpful email. Marcus assumed these were isolated incidents, unfortunate but unrelated coincidences that happened in any large business, and he pushed forward with his usual bravado, certain his instincts would course-correct whatever had gone wrong. Marcus called an emergency meeting with his senior staff that week, demanding explanations for the sudden silence from partners who had, until recently, seemed eager to expand their relationship with the company. No one in the room could offer him a satisfying answer, and his frustration curdled quickly into suspicion, convinced that someone within his own ranks must be sabotaging him out of jealousy or spite. He began scrutinizing every department with a paranoid intensity that unsettled even his most loyal employees, demanding reports and explanations for decisions that had gone unquestioned for years. The atmosphere inside the company shifted almost overnight, from one of confident momentum to one of quiet anxiety, as employees whispered among themselves about what exactly had triggered their usually composed leader's sudden unraveling. The bank that had extended his company's credit line years earlier requested an unexpected reassessment of the company's financial standing, citing irregularities they wanted clarified before renewing terms for the coming year. Marcus dismissed the request as routine bureaucracy, growing irritated rather than alarmed, still convinced that his reputation alone would smooth over any wrinkles. But as the weeks progressed, the company's stock began to slip steadily downward, shedding value in increments too consistent to be coincidence, and murmurs of concern started circulating among the board members who had once praised his leadership without hesitation. Marcus grew increasingly agitated, pacing his office late into the evenings, unable to identify the source of the sudden instability, threatening everything he believed he had built alone. In his frustration, he began making decisions that only deepened the crisis, lashing out at employees he suspected of disloyalty, and terminating several senior staff members whose only crime had been asking difficult questions during meetings. He fired a logistics director who had quietly warned him weeks earlier that certain client relationships seemed to be cooling without clear cause. He dismissed an assistant who suggested the company revisit its outdated contracts, snapping at her that he did not need anyone second-guessing decisions that had made him a success. Each rash move stripped away another layer of institutional knowledge the company desperately needed, and with every departure, the walls around Marcus grew a little thinner, though he remained blind to the pattern forming right in front of him. It was Robert Coleman, a former operations director who had resigned in quiet disgust months earlier, who finally cracked open the truth Marcus had spent years refusing to see. Robert requested a private meeting under the pretense of discussing a potential consulting arrangement, and Marcus, desperate for any solution that might stabilize the sinking company, agreed without hesitation. Sitting across from him in a quiet cafe far from the office, Robert asked a question that landed like a physical blow. Did Marcus honestly believe he had built every one of those rescue deals 5 years ago entirely on his own? Marcus scoffed, insisting, of course he had, that he remembered every late night, every negotiation, every signature that had pulled the company back from ruin. Robert slid a thin folder across the table without another word, and Marcus opened it with growing confusion that quickly hardened into disbelief as he flipped through page after page of internal documents. Every strategic memo from that period, every restructuring proposal, every carefully worded email negotiating new terms with the banks, all of it bore the fingerprints of Harlow Strategic Partners, a firm Marcus had always assumed operated independently on his behalf. Robert explained, quietly and without malice, that Harlow Strategic Partners had never been an outside firm at all, but rather a private entity controlled entirely by one woman working discreetly behind the scenes. Marcus stared at the papers in his hands, his throat tightening, refusing to let the obvious conclusion take shape in his mind even as the evidence stared back at him in black and white. Robert watched Marcus's face carefully as the realization began to dawn, offering no satisfaction or sympathy in his expression, only the flat honesty of a man who had grown tired of watching arrogance masquerade as competence. He told Marcus quietly that he had known the truth for years, having stumbled upon it himself during a routine audit long before he ever considered resigning from the company. He said he had stayed silent out of respect for Angela, who had never once asked him to keep her secret but whose evident wish for privacy he had chosen to honor regardless. Now, watching the company he had once been proud to work for crumble under the weight of decisions made without her steady hand behind them, Robert said he no longer felt any obligation to protect a truth that Marcus desperately needed to face. He spent the following days in a fog of denial, digging through old records and financial statements late into the night, searching for any explanation that did not point toward the truth Robert had handed him. But the deeper he dug, the more undeniable the pattern became. Signatures and strategic language that matched letters Angela had once written him early in their relationship, phrasing and instincts he now recognized with a sickening clarity he had spent years refusing to acknowledge. Every rescue, every negotiation, every miracle he had credited to his own genius bore her invisible signature underneath layers of corporate distance she had carefully constructed to protect his pride. The realization did not arrive as a single crushing blow, but as a slow, suffocating tide, rising higher with every document he uncovered, until he could no longer breathe beneath the weight of what he had done. While Marcus drowned in the wreckage of his own arrogance, Angela had quietly begun building something entirely new for herself, free from the shadow of a marriage that had asked her to shrink instead of grow. She used the small savings she had kept separate over the years to open her own consulting practice, offering the same sharp strategic instincts that had once saved Marcus's company anonymously, only now under her own name for the first time in her career. She rented a small office downtown during those early weeks, furnishing it modestly with second-hand furniture and a single plant she kept on the windowsill, refusing to spend money on appearances she had never valued to begin with. Her first client came through a referral from someone who had worked alongside Harlow Strategic Partners years earlier, without ever knowing the woman behind the name, a coincidence that made Angela smile quietly to herself when she realized how small the world of serious business truly was. She worked long hours during those first months, rebuilding a client base entirely from scratch under her own name for the first time in her professional life, yet she found a kind of joy in the labor that had been missing from her marriage for years. There was something deeply satisfying about signing her own name to her own work, about walking into a room and being seen fully, rather than standing quietly in someone else's shadow. Word spread quickly among the circles she had always quietly operated within. Executives who remembered her sound judgment from years of unnamed collaboration, investors who trusted her instincts more than they trusted flashier, louder voices in the industry. Within a few short months, her client roster included companies far larger and more prominent than the one she had left behind, each of them eager to work with the woman whose reputation, once hidden, was finally stepping into the light it had always deserved. Executives who had worked alongside Marcus over the years began to understand, quietly and among themselves, that the true intelligence behind many of his most celebrated decisions had never actually belonged to him. Angela's name started appearing in industry publications, not as someone's spouse or a footnote in someone else's success story, but as a formidable strategist in her own right, sought after for her calm precision and her ability to see solutions others missed entirely. She gave interviews when asked, always measured, always gracious, never once mentioning Marcus's name or using her past to score points against the man who had discarded her. Her reputation grew not through revenge, but through the simple, undeniable quality of her work, and that distinction mattered more to her than any public reckoning ever could. Marcus saw her name for the first time in a business journal left open on a colleague's desk, a feature detailing her rapid rise as an independent consultant reshaping strategy for several major firms in the region. He stared at the photograph accompanying the article, her expression calm and composed, in a way that struck him harder than any confrontation could have. And for the first time since the divorce, something like genuine grief settled into his chest. He realized, reading her measured words in that interview, that he had spent years standing beside brilliance and calling it his own, blind to the value of the woman who had never once demanded recognition for the empire she quietly built around him. It was in that quiet, humiliating moment, alone in his office with a magazine open on his desk, that Marcus finally understood the full weight of what he had thrown away in the rain. The company's troubles reached their breaking point at the annual shareholder meeting held that spring, a gathering that would later be remembered throughout the industry as the day everything changed. The boardroom was packed with anxious investors demanding answers about the company's plummeting stock price and its increasingly uncertain future, their patience for Marcus's reassurances long since exhausted. Whispers moved through the room about the possibility of bankruptcy, about a company once celebrated as a rising star, now teetering on the edge of collapse under the weight of decisions no one fully understood. Marcus stood at the front of the room, sweat beading at his temples despite the air conditioning, struggling to offer explanations for numbers that told a story he could no longer control. In the middle of his faltering presentation, the meeting's coordinator interrupted to announce the arrival of a representative from an investment group interested in acquiring a controlling stake to stabilize the company's future. The doors at the back of the room opened, and a hush fell over the crowd as every head turned to see who might be walking through them at this critical hour. Angela entered wearing a simple dark suit, her posture composed, her expression unreadable, carrying herself with the same quiet confidence that had defined her throughout every year. Marcus had failed to notice it. Marcus rose halfway out of his chair, his mouth open, unable to form a single coherent word as the woman he had thrown out into a rainstorm walked calmly toward the front of the room he had once ruled without question. Angela did not raise her voice or gloat over the stunned silence that followed her entrance, choosing instead to address the room with the same measured composure she had carried through every private negotiation of her career. She explained, calmly and without embellishment, that Harlow Strategic Partners had been responsible for the company's survival 5 years earlier, and she laid out the documentation to prove it, without leaving room for doubt or dispute. She displayed emails, contracts, and strategic memos on the screen behind her, each one bearing dates and signatures that traced back years before anyone in that room had ever heard her name mentioned in connection with the company. The evidence unfolded methodically, page by page, until every investor and board member in attendance understood with total clarity that the empire they had credited to one man's brilliance had, in truth, always rested on the shoulders of the woman he discarded. Marcus stood frozen at the front of the room, as the truth settled over the crowd like a physical weight, watching decades of assumed credibility dissolve in real time before dozens of witnesses who had once admired him without question. Board members exchanged uneasy glances, some already reaching for their phones, others simply staring at Marcus with expressions that mixed disbelief and quiet contempt in equal measure. Angela concluded her presentation without a hint of triumph in her voice, stating plainly that her investment group was prepared to inject the capital necessary to stabilize the company, provided certain leadership changes were made immediately. The room erupted into hushed, urgent conversation, and within the hour, a vote had been called that would determine whether Marcus Reed retained any role at all in the company that still bore his name. The vote did not go in his favor, and by the end of that week, Marcus had been formally removed from his position as chief executive, stripped of the title he had once worn like armor against every insecurity he carried. News of his downfall spread quickly through industry circles and eventually into local papers, painting a portrait of a man whose success had been built, unknowingly and completely, on the quiet labor of a wife he had cast aside without gratitude. His family, once so quick to dismiss Angela's worth, fell into an embarrassed silence that no amount of denial could undo. Their earlier cruelty toward her, now a matter of public record, whispered about at every social gathering they attended. Friends who had once flattered him at every turn stopped returning his calls entirely, their loyalty revealed, in the end, to have been nothing more than proximity to his money and his title. Marcus spent the weeks following his removal in a state of quiet devastation, wandering through an apartment far smaller than the house he once shared with Angela, forced to sit alone, with the consequences of years of accumulated pride. He replayed old memories obsessively, searching for the exact moment he had stopped seeing her as a partner and started seeing her as an obstacle to the image he wanted the world to believe about him. Eventually, unable to bear the weight of his own silence any longer, he reached out to Angela, requesting nothing more than a single conversation, uncertain whether she would even agree to see him after everything that had happened between them. To his surprise, she agreed, choosing a quiet cafe, far from the cameras, and the whispers that now followed both their names through the city. He arrived early, sitting nervously at a corner table, rehearsing words that felt inadequate the moment he tried to arrange them into something resembling an apology worthy of the harm he had caused. When Angela arrived, calm and composed as always, he found himself struggling to meet her eyes, the weight of his own shame pressing down harder than he had anticipated in the days leading up to this meeting. He apologized at length, admitting every failure he could name, the years of dismissiveness, the cruelty of that final rainy night, the blindness that had let him believe he alone had built something that had never truly been his alone to claim. Angela listened without interrupting, her expression gentle but unreadable, allowing him the full weight of his own confession before she finally spoke. She told him, in a voice free of anger, but heavy with honesty, that he had not lost her in a single night, however dramatic and painful that final scene in the rain had been. She explained that he had lost her slowly, in 1,000 smaller moments spread across years, every time he chose his pride over the truth sitting quietly beside him, every time he let his family's cruelty go unchallenged, every time he looked past her, toward the applause of strangers, instead of the sacrifice of the woman who loved him. Marcus felt something inside him finally break as she spoke, the last fragile piece of his defensiveness, giving way beneath the simple, undeniable accuracy of her words. He put his face in his hands and wept openly at that small cafe table. No longer the confident executive the world had once known, but simply a man mourning everything his own arrogance had cost him. In the months that followed, Angela's investment group completed its acquisition of a controlling stake in the company, and she made it clear from the outset that her intentions had nothing to do with revenge against the man who had once discarded her. She thought first and foremost of the thousands of employees whose livelihoods depended on the company's survival, people who had done nothing to deserve losing their jobs because of decisions made far above their heads. She appointed a new leadership team built on competence and integrity rather than charisma or flattery, individuals who had proven their worth through years of quiet, reliable work rather than boardroom theatrics. Under her guidance, the company began a slow, steady recovery, rebuilding the trust of investors and clients who had once questioned whether it could survive its very public unraveling. Marcus, for his part, refused every offer of special treatment that came his way during the company's restructuring, understanding on some fundamental level that he needed to rebuild himself from the ground up rather than accept a rescue he had not earned. He started over in an entry-level logistics role at a smaller regional firm, learning for the first time in his adult life what it meant to work without the cushion of assumed authority or inherited respect. He listened more than he spoke during those early months, a habit entirely foreign to the man he had been just a year earlier, absorbing lessons from colleagues who had no idea about the empire he had once presided over, and then lost. Slowly, painfully, he began to understand what humility actually felt like, not as a punishment, but as a kind of quiet, necessary education he should have received decades earlier. His days at the smaller firm were nothing like the life he had once known, filled with early mornings, loading shipment manifests, and long afternoons fielding complaints from clients who had no idea they were speaking to a man who had once run an entire company. His new coworkers found him strange at first, a middle-aged man with the polish of someone accustomed to much larger rooms, quiet and unusually attentive during meetings where he once would have dominated every conversation. Slowly, though, they warmed to him, appreciating his willingness to take on tasks others avoided, and his genuine curiosity about processes he once would have delegated without a second thought. He kept a small notebook in his desk drawer during those years, jotting down lessons he wished someone had taught him decades earlier, reminders about listening before speaking, and about the quiet dignity of work done well without any audience to witness it. It became, in its own strange way, the most honest education of his adult life, one built entirely from the wreckage of everything he had once taken for granted. Years passed, and the sharp edges of scandal softened into something closer to legend, the kind of story people told at industry conferences as a cautionary tale about pride and the value of unseen labor. Angela's consulting firm grew into one of the most respected strategic practices in the region, her name now synonymous with the kind of quiet brilliance that did not need spectacle to prove its worth. Marcus, through years of steady, unglamorous work, eventually rebuilt a modest but honest career, one built entirely on his own merit this time, without borrowed genius or hidden support, propping him up from the shadows. The two crossed paths again at a large industry conference, dedicated to honoring leadership and innovation across the business community, an event neither had expected to attend alongside the other after everything that had passed between them. Marcus approached her during a quiet moment between sessions, his posture humble, in a way that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who had known him during his years of unchecked arrogance. He thanked her, sincerely, not for any grand gesture, but for the harder truth she had shown him, the lesson that had cost him everything he once valued, and had ultimately given him back something far more important in return. Angela listened, her expression warm but composed, and when he finished speaking, she offered him a small, genuine smile that carried none of the old bitterness either of them might have expected to still linger between them. Forgiveness, she told him gently, does not mean returning to what once was, but rather choosing to release both people so that each can continue moving forward into whatever life still waits ahead of them. Diane, watching the conference proceedings from a modest seat near the back of the room, said nothing when Angela's name was called for the award, though something in her expression suggested a quiet, reluctant acknowledgement of a truth she had spent years refusing to see. She had grown older in the time since the divorce, her sharp opinions softened by the humbling realization that her own cruelty had played some part in the collapse of a marriage that might otherwise have endured. She never apologized to Angela directly, pride still holding its grip on her even in old age, but she stopped speaking of her with contempt, and in certain families, that silence itself becomes its own quiet form of surrender. Marcus noticed his mother's changed demeanor that evening, but chose not to comment on it, understanding by now that some reckonings happen too slowly and too privately to ever be spoken aloud. Later that evening, under the bright lights of the conference's main stage, Angela was called forward to accept an award, recognizing her as one of the most inspiring leaders in the region's business community, a recognition earned entirely through her own quiet persistence and skill. She walked up the steps with the same steady composure she had carried through every hardship life had handed her, unshaken by applause, unmoved by spectacle, grounded in a sense of self-worth that no one had ever been able to take from her. Down in the audience, standing among hundreds of other attendees, Marcus rose to his feet and began clapping before anyone else in the room, his applause the first and loudest, a quiet, public acknowledgement of everything he had once failed to see. Angela caught his eye for just a moment from the stage, and in that brief exchange, there was no anger left between them, only the simple, hard-won peace of two people who had both, in their own ways, finally learned what truly mattered. Some people never stand at the very top of the room, never claim the title or the spotlight or the applause that comes with visible success, and yet they are the very foundation holding the entire structure upright. It is only when that foundation is taken for granted, dismissed, or discarded that its true weight becomes impossible to ignore, and by then, the cost of that realization often arrives far too late to undo the damage already done. Angela never asked for recognition during all those quiet years of sacrifice, content to let her work speak in whispers rather than declarations. And it was precisely that humility that made her strength so undeniable once the truth finally came to light. And somewhere in that lesson lies a quiet warning for anyone too quick to dismiss the people standing silently behind them, because the ones who ask for nothing are often the very ones holding everything together.